Good evening, everyone. I'm Joseph Cotto, and let me tell you about an epic story of victory, defeat, friendship, betrayal, heroism, cowardice, deep respect, blind hatred, and above all else, the struggle for survival. It is my new book, Runaway Masters, a true story of slavery, freedom, triumph, and tragedy beyond 1619 and 1776. Check it out on Amazon by following the link below. The paperback is $9.99 US, while the Kindle version is $4.99 US. If you are a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, you will be able to read it for free. Hope that you enjoy the book. Joining me tonight is Luke Ford. Luke, how's it going?
Great. Joseph, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. Good to hear, obviously, that you're doing well. We're going to be discussing how the right has reacted to COVID, which this is a matter, even though Luke and I have some pretty serious disagreements, we are generally, I think it's safe to say, on the same page when it comes to the severity of COVID. And I think we have generally similar criticisms, perhaps, as to how the right has handled this pandemic. But in any case, please, if you have reasonable and responsible question or comment for Luke or myself, please do leave it via Streamlabs. Thank you very much in advance. I will include the link to Streamlabs on the in the live chat if I could ever get the damn thing on there. I have it on there. Anyway, so Luke, when it comes to dealing with the pandemic, a lot of people on the right tend to minimize it, and they think perhaps it's some sort of conspiracy, and they hate the vaccines, and they also would, in many, not all cases, obviously, arguably not even in most cases, but in quite a few cases, they would rather even commit a federal felony by getting a false, vaccine card than just get vaccinated. And they would do this where there are vaccine passports in force, and it's really vaccine passport laws or regulations in force. I mean, and it's really interesting that there is this level of disdain for the vaccine and a disbelief in the severity of COVID on the American right. Although I must say, before we go on, that one also sees this in certain precincts of the Democratic left, specifically within downscale inner city neighborhoods populated by Blacks and Hispanics. And so you have these whites who are on the right. I think it's across the socioeconomic spectrum that are very skeptical of COVID and very anti-vaccine. And then you have these very downscale Blacks and Hispanics on the Democratic side on the left who are very anti-vaccine and COVID skeptical. It's a fascinating situation. It really is. Anything to say about it starting out, Luke?
I was talking to a friend who's center left yesterday, and I said to him, I'm embarrassed by the response of the dissident right, which I consider myself fairly friendly to COVID vaccines, because out of all the issues up for discussion, this one seems to have the least reason for dissonance. It seems obvious to me that those vaccines approved for use in the United States to combat COVID have been highly effective, that approximately 99% of the people who are hospitalized or die from COVID these days are not vaccinated. So it just embarrasses me that people with whom I thought I shared a lot in common are taking what I see as just a completely idiotic response. And my friend center left said, well, in the 1960s, it might have been my side that was more vaccine hesitant. So I'm not sure there's anything inherent right-wing versus left-wing in reaction to vaccines, but that certainly is the reaction right now, that the popular right, the dissident right seems all on board with vaccine skepticism, for which I see no evidence. It just seems insane, self-defeating, stupid, idiotic, antisocial, incredibly destructive, just about the dumbest thing that I can imagine. What is it about the populist right or the dissident right that makes them so vaccine skeptical? Because there's nothing inherent in most right-wing ideologies of which I'm aware that leads one to be vaccine skeptical. Joseph?
It's a good question, and I will say it's not just the dissident right or even the populist right. Even some of like the mainstream Fox News type right is on this bandwagon. Not all of it, and I don't think there's anything inherently right wing about this vaccine skepticism, nor do I think there's anything inherently left wing about it. I think that it really is a reaction to, one might say, current events, and whichever side feels perhaps less trusting of institutions takes this anti-vaccine course of action. But it's also not just the vaccine, as I said, it's also downplaying the severity of COVID tremendously, which is something very quite different from, opposing the vaccine, even though both of these things do, blend together after a certain point. But it's really fascinating. Why do you suppose, Luke, looking at the American right specifically right now, it's very popular to downplay the severity of COVID. And it's also very popular to make up crazy claims about the vaccine, like it'll change your DNA, like it makes no difference as to whether or not you get COVID. Some people even claim that vaccinated people are responsible for the spread of COVID. Why do you think that these tropes right now are very popular on the American right?
I think it's some combination of these tropes have become a form of identity that people are kind of rallying around this, and so I'm just going to assume that what people say is often not what they really believe. I think people are saying things as an expression of their disgust for the elites. So we've had this growing alienation between the elites and the masses, and this is just the latest manifestation. So we've had that with regard to Brexit, or pretty much all the elites were opposed to Brexit, but Britain voted for Brexit anyway. Almost all the elites were opposed for Donald Trump in 2016, but the country voted for Donald Trump anyway. So there is this huge gulf between the elites and the masses, and I don't inherently side with either. Like, I don't think that the elites are usually right, and I don't think that the masses are usually right. To me, you've got to take this individual situation by individual situation. I don't automatically side with expertise. I have been the most lukewarm pontificator with regard to COVID since March. I've had very few strong opinions. It's only the last few months when I see this anti-vax movement that I finally get a strong opinion. So you want to tell me that COVID is nothing? Okay, then I have a strong opinion, because we've got over 4 million people dead worldwide, over 600,000 dead in the United States. On 9/11, we had about 3,000 dead. So you're telling me that for months on end, where we had a 9/11 number of deaths every day, that was insignificant? So to that, I finally get a strong opinion on COVID. Or to people who say, look, the average person who's dying of COVID, I have a friend who was contending to me the average person who died of COVID, it only cost him 1 year of life. I'm not an expert. No one confuses me with with having expertise in epidemiology, but according to the most comprehensive review of the statistics, the average COVID death costs 16 years of life. That's not trivial. That's not 1 year. That's not people with 1 foot in the grave. So yeah, I didn't have any strong opinions on COVID, on how to react to COVID, whether lockdowns were justified or not justified. I was doing a show talking about it, but I had no strong opinions. But you want to give me something really stupid, like COVID is nothing, that COVID vaccines are dangerous, that the average person who dies from COVID only costs him 1 year of life, that they're manipulating the death certificates on a mass scale to try to get more government funding. Okay, you give me something stupid, I will react to that. And it also then causes me to question, who is this person? And I got nothing in common with this crowd that's anti-vax and COVID skeptical.
Yeah, it's one thing that have heard over the last, I think, 2 days. I got a bulletin from my local medical community, and people who are in the hospital now, this is here in Central Florida, they're not the older people who were in the hospital at this time last year, generally speaking. There are a lot of younger people in their 20s even. And these people are suffering from COVID. And I just made a tweet about this, and people were saying, no, it's not happening. I'm lying. People were lying to me within my local medical community who work in the hospital they just decided to lie to me because I don't know, maybe they just felt like doing it to get a rise out of me. But the fact of the matter is that there is now this subculture. I think it's really an online subculture, although it certainly has in real life elements too, of downplaying anything to do with COVID being a pandemic, which is what it is. And I don't really know as to, it has to do with the distrust of elites, but I don't know why people would think that COVID is some kind of elite thing. It's a pandemic, and it has fundamentally, the virus has no politics.
Well, I think another factor here is that COVID cost Donald Trump the election. Donald Trump was cruising to re-election. And if he'd only appeared to have average level of competence with regard to COVID, he still would have won re-election. But because he appeared to have way below average, and I'm not saying that perception's accurate, for my opinion is that he did okay. Not good, not bad. I think he did okay, about average with leaders around the Western industrialized world. But because the widespread perception, particularly in the suburbs, where Trump lost this 2020 election, was that he was way below average in response to COVID. Therefore, I think a lot of the rage from the COVID skeptical crowd, it's really a form of identitarianism. They feel like the country's been stolen from them because of COVID, that they felt certain that Donald Trump was headed for re-election, and now suddenly Joe Biden and the Democrats control the House of Representatives, the Senate, the presidency, in addition to all the other high forms of ground in American cultural, political, and economic life. So half the country feels like the country is being stolen from them, and stolen from them because of COVID and because of the way elites and public health officials and the news media seem to conspire to try to make Donald Trump and the Republicans look particularly heinous, and where the public health officials were putting forward such contradictory information, such as it's the most evil thing in the world for you to do right now to gather with other people unless it's to fight racism. So understandably, people had a really strong reaction to that. But a more sophisticated understanding, I think, of the facts on the ground is that outdoor transmission of COVID is very, very rare. And so on the one hand, you can say, oh, all these hundreds of thousands of people gathering to protest the death of George Floyd and systemic racism, this is heinous. These are super spreader events. This is going to do all the horrible things that the public health officials warned us against. Well, it probably didn't do that. I'm not aware of any evidence that these mass rallies outside against racism were super spreader events. Now, on the one hand, it completely contradicts much of the public health authorities' proclamations that it's a very evil thing for people to gather together. So we surely by now can be a little more sophisticated and understand that outdoor transmission of COVID is relatively rare when compared to indoor transmission. But I think it's the combination of it's also, you see the government naked. All right. Normally, government decides things by consensus. Bureaucrats, scientists behind doors, they decide things by consensus. Now, suddenly, we see the naked government. We see bureaucrats, politicians, and scientists arguing with each other. So normally, it's presented to us as though XYZ is settled science. Now, during the COVID crisis, we see that much of what we've previously been propagandized is settled science, isn't settled science. In fact, much of it is economically motivated special pleading. Much of it's politically motivated special pleading. Much of it is just various groups and individuals jockeying for power. And so we get to see the government naked. We get to see that what we've been told to regard as science, and science says, is really self-interested individuals just like ourselves who are responding to incentives. For example, all science now is funded by massive grants, either from the government or from private corporations. And it's not just given to individuals to do what they like. Usually science is funded by funders who have certain expectations. And so if you want to get funding for something scientific, you need to do research that someone with money is going to pay for, and they're only going to pay for a type of research that is going to get them the results that they want. And so there are tremendous incentives to distort the science, distort results, to try to keep that money train flowing. So science has proven itself, Science Incorporated has proven itself as unable to police itself. Science Incorporated has shown itself that it cannot be trustworthy, that science now demands outside intervention. Science Incorporated now demands considerable skepticism. And so I think a lot of these inchoate responses of COVID skepticism and vaccine skepticism, there is some legitimate grounds there, because people now realize, because of the pandemic, how much of what they've been told by governments, by bureaucrats, by politicians, by scientists as being, unimpeachable scientific truth is in fact not unimpeachable scientific truth. And people realize that so often what the experts are telling us to do is not accurate, or the experts are following the money and following their own incentives, or politicians are following the money or following their own incentives. So much of what is being regarded as received wisdom, people are realizing increasingly since the 1960s that it's not so wise and it's not so true, and that the people in power and the elites, to me, the elites are no better or worse than you or I and the average person, but they're certainly no better, they're certainly no worse. They are self-interested, they respond to incentives. So I don't abide by automatically distrusting expertise. And I also don't abide by automatically embracing rejection of expertise. You have to take it one situation at a time and ask, okay, how much expertise do these experts really have? For example, we were told after Trump was elected that our intelligence community had uniformly decided that Russia had hacked the 2016 election, and this was a very serious thing. Well, really what happened was that the head of intelligence gathered together some of his like-minded cronies, and they faced incentives to please the guy who was in charge, and so they gave him the ruling and the proclamation that he wanted to have. It wasn't the intelligence community saying that. It was certain self-interested individuals telling a boss what he wanted to hear. And so often when we're told science says, it's not so much science says, but it's certain self-interested individuals in Science Incorporated who face certain incentives and have certain ideological biases. That's what's going on. So I think we need to have as much skepticism of expertise as we have skepticism of rejecting expertise. We need to understand what are the incentives that the experts face. We need to make a decision with what's the best available evidence, what's the downside of following this expertise, what's the upside of following the expertise, how likely is it that the expert is right. These are all tough questions. They all require work. People would rather take the easy way out and either reject expertise, which is the dissident side of the equation, or the popular side of the equation, or just automatically embrace expertise, which is like the conventional and the elitist assumption. We cannot either automatically embrace or reject expertise. We have to do the work. There's no easy way out.
No, there most certainly is not any easy way out. It's interesting because even though Luke and I have different views on the legitimacy of the 2020 election in certain states, I want to make that clear. We do agree that the COVID issue certainly was a negative one for Donald Trump, and it hurt him, especially in suburban areas. And what's really intriguing is that back in 2020, when Trump was and he still is, but he's been consistently pro-vaccine. He doesn't favor mandates, but he does favor people getting the vaccine, and he favors what one might call a pro-vaccine culture. But at the same time, back then, last year, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were profoundly anti-vaccine. Biden and Harris, as a matter of fact, said they would not get the vaccine. And a lot of people in the Democratic media, and of course within the politicians in the Democratic Party, said they wouldn't get the vaccine either. But then once Trump lost and they assumed power, once the Biden administration assumed power, it was a totally different story. It was everyone get the vaccine. Now Biden is actually contemplating vaccine mandates, and they are imposing vaccine mandates already on certain elements of the federal government. Actually on the federal government itself. So it's really an interesting situation where you have this topsy-turvy scenario. And now I do think that a lot of people on the right who oppose the vaccine today opposed it even when Donald Trump was in office, and he was really, revving up the production of the vaccine, and obviously fostering a climate in the federal government, which was very receptive to private companies developing the vaccine. I think a lot of the people who oppose the vaccine now opposed it back then on the right, but it's really been interesting to see how the right has become quite fanatically anti-vaccine in the wake of Biden's assuming the Oval Office. Meanwhile, the left has abandoned its vaccine skepticism now that Trump isn't there anymore, and it's pro-vaccine to the point that even vaccine mandates are being lionized. Anything to say about this very unique phenomenon, Luke?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Joseph. Because COVID vaccine skepticism was being pushed by the Democrats in 2020, and now it's identified with the Republicans. So I don't think there's anything inherent about being either a Democrat or Republican with regard to COVID vaccine. So many of these things are just situational. So the situation in one situation, and the Democrats are skeptical and pushing skepticism of COVID vaccine. Situation changes. Now Republicans are pushing skepticism of COVID vaccine. So it reminds you once again that so much of what is quote unquote a scientific discussion is really ideologically and politically and agenda driven rather than being about truth and science. So, I mean, I think that the Democrats pushing vaccine skepticism in 2020, that was highly irresponsible. It was awful, absolutely awful. And it seems to me that the best thing that Trump did with regard to COVID was to fund a massive Operation Warp Speed to get vaccines. I look at my home country of Australia, and they didn't invest in as many vaccines as the United States did. They selected 2 vaccines that could be made in Australia, and one of them turned out to give people false HIV positive readings, and so they abandoned that vaccine. And then the other, AstraZeneca, 1 in a million people would get blood clots that they would then try to link to AstraZeneca. But the word link is such a really shifty term. Like, you could link me to anyone on earth or any ideology if you put enough effort into it. Link does not mean causation. So the many of the elites and the media were highly irresponsible, I think, with regard to AstraZeneca, that 1 in a million person who gets an AstraZeneca vaccine then develops blood clots. That's not much higher than people who take aspirin or all sorts of other substances. Anyway, people in Australia got scared, and the AstraZeneca rollout got slowed down, and the government had only invested in those 2 vaccines. So with Operation Warp Speed, the United States invested in multiple vaccines, so the United States was way ahead of the game. And Japan, think of the Japanese on the distant right. We often look at the Japanese as the example of a nation that works, of a coherent society. But what goes along with their nationalism and sense of superiority is that they did not believe that vaccine trials for non-Japanese were valid results. So they delayed their vaccine rollout by about 4 months so that they could test the vaccine on the Japanese. And I mean, they completely botched it up. I mean, they should have had, by all accounts, a glorious Olympics, filled with vaccinated people cheering it on, but their own sense of superiority and their own incompetence, came back to bite them in the butt. So usually it's a great thing to think that your people are superior, but if it leads you to do stupid things like the Japanese did, then obviously it's self-defeating.
Yeah, obviously, it's correct. If people think that in some way, shape, or form they cannot learn from the experiences of others because those people are different than they are, it's that's quite ignorant. And Luke brings up a great point. Looking at, I suppose, the COVID vaccines in the U.S., a lot of people are very anti-vaccine for, too many different reasons to begin getting into here. But one of them is they claim that the vaccine is going to kill you. And they talk about blood clots with regard to the Johnson & Johnson shot. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine there was even far less linkage. And as you mentioned, link is a very shifty word, but there was even less linkage of blood clots to J&J than there was, blood clots to AstraZeneca. But still, these hyper fears over, blood clots as a result of the J&J shot resulted in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine having a very choppy rollout, to say the absolute least. And that's particularly tragic because the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a single dose shot. And that means obviously it can be administered to many more people in a much shorter period of time than the 2-dose Moderna or Pfizer shots. And it's obvious that people have to be careful about anything they put into their body. But the hysteria over, am I going to die because of a J&J shot, really did hamper people getting this vaccine that I think is particularly it's a particularly great idea for a large country in which you need to get a lot of people vaccinated in a very short period of time. And people are focusing on, there were only 28 cases, as I recall, of people who had any blood clottage whatsoever after getting the Johnson & Johnson shot out of about 7 million people who had received the Johnson & Johnson shot. But people talk about these 28 cases where there's not even, it's not even conclusive that any of them came about because of the vaccine, but they focus on these 28 cases like it's 28 out of 100. And it's really sad to see people do this.
And let's not forget that Pfizer essentially manipulated the election, probably cost Trump the election by putting their vaccine trial on ice. If they'd followed normal procedures prior to the election, they would have announced they had a vaccine that worked, and that likely would have shifted the election to Donald Trump. But they did not follow their procedures. They stopped their procedures. They put their procedures on ice. They put their vaccine trial on ice to deny Trump the election. And this doesn't get talked about. Pfizer shut down work on the world's most important clinical trial until the day after the election. I mean, Pfizer executives admitted that Pfizer, against its protocols, put its vaccine trial on ice from late October until the day after the election. So this is another reason why people have so much skepticism of Big Pharma and of elites, because the elites were doing everything that they could in 2020 to ensure that Donald Trump was not reelected. And then one other factor I think that plays into vaccine skepticism is that probably more than any other country of which I'm aware, Americans venerate the value of freedom. So I come from Australia, and in Australia, the highest value is fairness. So we have about 20 different expressions for fair. Have a fair go, fair dinkum. This is the Australian preoccupation with what is fair. The American preoccupation is freedom, because America came from a different British Empire. So the British Empire of the 19th century was much more affected by Enlightenment values and universalism and egalitarianism than the British Empire that gave birth to the American Revolution. So Americans venerate freedom more than any other people of which I'm aware. And so government mandates are received with more skepticism in the United States than any other country of which I'm aware. Where I come from, Australia, and many other countries in the Western industrialized world, people generally speaking believe that government is acting in their best interests. That is the general expectation. And so when the government says to lock down, when the government says to socially distance, when the government says to get a vaccine, by and large, people in Australia, New Zealand, England, Europe go along with that because they fundamentally have faith in their government, because their government, by and large, looks like them, sounds like them, and reflects them. In the United States, that's not the case. So in the United States, when the government says something, people have much more skepticism, and they're much quicker to rebel and to not follow government edicts, because Americans, I think, less than any other Western industrialized nation, trust that their government is acting in their best interests.
And I will just say that if you have a reasonable, responsible question or comment for Luke or myself, please do leave it via Streamlabs. Thank you very much in advance. We are going to go to Streamlabs right now. And let's see, I'm refreshing the page. So hopefully the stuff will pop up. It's coming along. It's doing the spinning cartwheel. And I'm just sitting here waiting for the stuff to come up. It can take a minute sometimes. Sometimes it's instantaneous. Sometimes it takes a minute. What are you going to do? It's the wonders of technology. They really do make you wonder. Okay, let's see here. From Row House. What is your two's view on American education? I was just told America takes so many East Asians for our top medical and computer jobs due to superior education there. Can America do much to address this problem? Is it a teacher problem or a student one? I think fundamentally it is a student problem. Actually, Bob Weisberg wrote a brilliant book about this. But there's no question that education is done more effectively in the East than it is in the U.S. But at the same time, to be blunt, that the average student in China is more intelligent than the average student in the U.S. So that's just just throwing that out there. But I think fundamentally it is a problem of students, and I think that if you have a lower quality of student, there's not much that really can be done to address the problem of garbage education, because at the end of the day, the kids are only going to assimilate so much information, and due to their unique aptitudes, one might say, you can't expect a terrible deal from them all the same. Although that's not to say there are very intelligent people in the U.S. Obviously, there are. I just think I know that as time goes by, the IQ here is dropping. Luke, anything to say about what Rohouse brought up?
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything you said. And then I just had an additional thought about why the right has been so skeptical
Mhm.
of vaccines and of public health authority pronouncements with regard to COVID. And I'm just remembering the CDC comes out every year with numbers of Americans who supposedly died of the flu. And yet you and I and anyone listening cannot think of anybody who died from the flu. Like, name me one celebrity who died from the flu. So where on earth does the CDC get these numbers of 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 60,000 people in a year in the United States dying from the flu? Well, they use some kind of algorithm. It's not based on death certificates. So if you just went by death certificates, you might get 1,000 people a year or 5,000. But the CDC has been making up and promoting phony numbers about the people dying from the flu, in large part to promote flu vaccines. So that's fairly established. I've got a whole section on it on my website. If you just search it out on my website, lukeford.net. So we have so much corruption of public health, and even our most prestigious institutions, the CDC is regarded worldwide as the best at what it's doing. But even the CDC will come up with phony numbers to promote a flu vaccine. Now, someone might say to me, well, 40, you just said that the CDC makes up its flu numbers. How do we know it's not making up its COVID numbers? Well, that's why you have to do a little bit of work. It's not a matter of either you trust the CDC or you automatically distrust the CDC. You have to do the work. So the CDC comes up with its flu numbers by some kind of complicated algorithm that does not relate to death certificates. When it comes to COVID, this comes from death certificates. When we're told that 610,000 Americans have died from COVID, this comes from death certificates. Death certificates are taken seriously in the industrialized world. That doesn't mean that there's never been a mistake on a death certificate. But overwhelmingly, these are something that's conducted with seriousness, with diligence, that it's reviewed. It's not just making up numbers. So our COVID numbers, our COVID deaths come from death certificates. Our purported numbers of people who die from the flu each year, purported by the CDC, that does not come from death certificates. Those are numbers that they're guesstimating, estimating, and much of the time they seem to have been promoting scary numbers of flu-related deaths to try to promote flu vaccination. And why were they promoting this back in 2004? Because flu vaccine manufacturers were facing some kind of financial shortfall. And so they put the hard word on the CDC, hey, you got to start promoting flu vaccines. And the most effective way to do it is to say that tens of thousands of Americans are dying from the flu. And a lot of it was bogus.
And from Row House again, Greg Johnson, a man Luke knows, says the dissident right response to COVID made our side look dumb. Do you both agree our side was literally opposing the entire medical community, 100% based on what YouTubers said about it? Obviously, I'm not allied in any way with Greg Johnson, but in terms of how the right on the whole has responded to COVID, I would say absolutely it's made the right look dumb. It's made it look I was about to use a word that I would use off screen. Begins with an R and ends with a D. It's not hard to figure out what it is, but it's made the right look exactly like that. I look at some of the stuff that people say online on the right. These I'm not just talking about random people hiding behind some anonymous username on Twitter. I'm talking about people who are even on TV with their own shows or they're guests on big programs, radio shows, even columnists. And what they're saying is really, really stupid. And it creates a negative impression of the right, like a bunch of hicks, a bunch of people who cannot figure out their foot from a hole in the ground. And Luke is absolutely correct. You have to be nuanced about whether or not you trust the experts. The experts may be deserving of your trust or they might not be. It's a case by case basis. And the key words he mentioned, in my view, are you have to do the work. You really do have to do the work. And a lot of people on the right, also, as he said, are not doing the work. They're not. They're just taking this perspective that COVID isn't a big deal, the vaccine is evil, blah blah blah. And it's you're absolutely correct, also, Brohouse, about people dismissing with the entire medical community 100%. You said that literally opposing the entire medical community 100% based on what YouTubers said about it. A hell of a lot of that went on the right, still goes on the right, and it looks ridiculous and absurd. And sometimes, what someone on YouTube is saying sounds appealing to people, not only because they dislike the vaccine, but because this person is a medical doctor. But these are very fringe voices within the medical community that typically would not have the sort of information necessary, the data necessary to support their views if they were asked to, approve the validity of them through the scientific method. So I think that it's absolutely correct that the right looks dumb with all this, hardcore the hardcore absurd response to COVID, and the sort of reactionary opposition to the medical community, especially when people on YouTube are your source. It begins with an R and ends with a D. That's what it is. Luke, anything to say about what Rowhouse brought up?
Yeah, I agree with Greg Johnson and with Joseph Cotto on that. The right looks really stupid to the extent that the right has tried to deny or minimize the threat posed by COVID. On the other hand, there have been a ton of left-wing hysterias that have not lived up to the hype, such as heterosexual AIDS in the West, global cooling, the war on women, campus rape. So there have been so many innumerable examples, SARS, bird flu. There are so many left-wing hysterias where the left has been wrong and the right has been right. That should add some context. Also, the right's had some good points. All right, so I believe that COVID is a serious problem. Therefore, it's a serious problem if people are obese. That's a serious issue. This is not just about protecting the feelings of fatties, right? There is something that's more important than protecting the feelings of fatties, and that is they really need to lose some weight and get into shape. And the right is right to engage in a certain amount of fat shaming. Most Americans and most Australians are obese. That's disgusting. And if COVID is serious, and I believe COVID is serious, then in addition to making the case for the vaccine, you really should make the case that people should lose weight and most people need to do more exercise. And there's so much, public health announcements with regard to COVID to get people to socially distance and to completely deform their lives. That they can't go to church anymore, they can't gather with other people, even when it's outside, and there's minimal risk transmitting COVID outside compared to inside. That there have been many instinctive reactions on the right that I think have varying some validity, such as suspicion of Big Pharma, given that Big Pharma was essentially throwing the 2020 election to Joe Biden by stopping their protocols and stopping their trials of vaccines that would work. I think the religious right, is right that health and long life is not always should be the number one priority in life. There's also quality of life, that while social distancing may mitigate spread of the virus, it also comes with severe psychological and social costs that must be included in our calculus of what to do, what to mandate, and how to conduct our lives. I mean, people need people. I sound like Barbara Streisand. And so there have been some instinctive reactions by the right that I think have added to the conversation and have restored some sanity. So yeah, overall, I think the right has looked terrible, and it's also exposed the barrenness and the stupidity of right-wing media. I mean, the right has nothing as smart as the New York Times or the Washington Post or even the LA Times. I mean, it's really sad. The right-wing news media has been so pathetic with regard to COVID. Fox has steadily been pushing a fair amount of vaccine skepticism with no basis. Fox was frequently minimizing the severity of the COVID threat. The New York Post as well, American Thinker, like the Daily Caller, like all of the right-wing publications of which I'm aware were heavily invested in downplaying the threat of COVID. Right-wing talk radio was almost uniformly downplaying the threat of COVID. Fox News is a tabloid operation. That's a description, not a criticism, but it is a tabloid operation. It is aimed at like a 100 IQ crowd. It's not an erudite channel, and their populism is fun and amusing at times, and in a good cause at times. But with regard to COVID, it's just revealed how stupid much of the instinctive populist response is, in that it just denies the validity of expertise just as a knee-jerk response. So even if, let's say you truly believe that, let's say Joseph Cotto is 100% right about electoral fraud with regard to 2020, if you believe that, you have to be disappointed with the performance of the right-wing news media. Why didn't they work harder on this story? Why didn't they get more details out? Why didn't they put 12 reporters? The New York Times routinely puts 5, 10, 12, 15 reporters on a story, and they really get to the bottom of it. Why didn't the right-wing media do that? So for me, both with regard to 2020 election fraud, which I don't believe played a significant role, but let's say it did play a huge role, then the right-wing media has been pathetic in their reporting, in not going into depth. And they've also been pathetic, absolutely low IQ and moronic with regard to COVID.
Certainly. And I will say, by the way, even though Luke and I have different views on the election in certain states, believe it or not, in most states, he and I are on the same page about what happened in the election. And I say this because the presidential race is not one race. It's 50 different races, and it should be regarded as such. But, looking at how the conservative media, and I called this out back late last year when it started taking the totally insane claims of Lindell seriously and Sidney Powell about voting machines. That I knew was going to be something that I couldn't come back from. That the narrative was lost, and yet people were lapping up this utter garbage, and I identified it as garbage, and a lot of people got angry at me for that. But the bottom line is that the same sort of mindlessness that allowed that most unfortunate situation to come about is what also allowed the situation to come about where people who don't have much standing in the medical community are treated as experts because they say that COVID vaccines are a bad idea for 80-year-olds. And it also creates a situation where, these so-called experts are given a megaphone to say crap like, the vaccines could be worse than the pandemic, and it goes on and on and on. I can't even begin to think about all the utter garbage that I've seen. And so, the right-wing media has done a terrible job with this. I will say that the only thing that the right has, which I think is quite intellectual, actually, in a way, is the Epoch Times. They do a pretty decent job of covering stuff. They clearly have their perspective, but I think it's a fine publication, and it would be sort of like the New York Times of the right, but obviously doesn't have the funding necessary to be a full-fledged New York Times. But I think it has great goals, and I think it is a quite intellectual outlet. As far as Fox News goes, of course, Luke is on the money. And it's interesting because I've even come to the conclusion that Newsmax in certain cases is more intellectual than Fox News is. And Fox News is more like One America, I think, where you have a sort of very cheesy tabloid level setup. And I myself am not someone who thinks that Newsmax is any, great shake necessarily. But I think that, Fox News is just so banal in many cases that Newsmax intellectually outranks it, at least at certain times. Luke, anything to say about that before we move on?
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I just had an additional thought about the right and its, to be crazy reactions to COVID vaccines and to try to minimize COVID. And that is, since Ronald Reagan, there's been a knee-jerk response on a significant portion of the American right that government is the problem. And absolutely, there are some areas where government is the problem, but there are also areas where government is the solution. Like, different situations call for different responses. Some situations are best served by no government. Other situations are best served by limited government. Other situations by moderate government. And some situations are best served by big government. this knee-jerk response that government is the problem is the problem. This is stupidity. There are times when you need a massive government response. When you're waging war for the survival of your people, you need a massive government response. And when you have a deadly pandemic like COVID, you need a big government response. Now, for the left, using big government to protect people and to make people's lives better, that just comes naturally. So COVID, I think, did fit more naturally into the wheelhouse of the left. So, for example, when political elections in the United States are fought over issues of healthcare or responses to COVID, the left is usually going to do better. The left usually has fewer doubts about committing, massive government resources to deal with the problem. Now, this was a situation that called for a massive government response, and there's this widespread among the right dismissal of the importance of government. Government does some important things. There are people on the right, like Rick Perry, who, when he was running for president, he wanted to eliminate the energy department, but he didn't know what the energy department actually did. So anyone who says, I'm for eliminating an entire government department, but they don't know what that department actually does, I think you're an idiot. And the Heritage Foundation would come out with papers calling for the elimination of this and that government department. And occasionally government bureaucrats would invite those heritage researchers to come meet. And then they would explain to the heritage researchers what this particular government department actually did. And then Heritage would stop calling for the elimination of that government department. It's so easy to dismiss people and institutions that you know nothing about. And Michael Lewis wrote a very important book about this, the fifth risk. And he made some good points that there was significant portions of the Trump administration that were not particularly interested in administering, that were not particularly competent, that were not really up to speed with what was going on in these government departments that they were taking over, and who devalued the efforts of bureaucrats. Some bureaucrats are useless. A lot of bureaucrats are amazing people who get very little credit. And so, I mean, in California, we have public health officials in each county, and they have virtually unlimited power in dealing with a public health pandemic. And sometimes they make the right call, sometimes they make the wrong call. But government plays an important role. You can't just knee-jerk dismiss government. I think that's a stupid idea.
And from Douglas Edward 84, here in Canada, Quebec is planning on making vaccines mandatory for non-essential activities like restaurants and bars, movie theaters, et al. Other provinces likely to follow suit. Would this happen in the United States, or would it be unconstitutional? Well, it's interesting because, obviously neither Luke or I are lawyers, and we would never give anyone legal advice. But what I will say is that in the U.S., the mandates are already happening for people who work at certain companies or who work for certain government agencies. And I think that these mandates are only going to become more prevalent as time rolls along. There was a Supreme Court decision, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, in the early 1900s in 1905, and it held that vaccine mandates were constitutional when they were enforced by a state government. So, and this ruling was expanded upon by various federal courts last year, obviously in the wake of COVID. So I don't think that, I really don't think that that there is the idea that a lot of people on the right have that these vaccine mandates are unconstitutional, that they're losing the Constitution through these mandates, that their rights are being usurped. It's simply not true. The vaccine mandates have been constitutional since the early 1900s. And I cannot see how or why one would get the impression that all of a sudden a vaccine mandate is an erosion of one's rights. You might think that it's not a good idea. You might think it should be unconstitutional, but quite clearly the Supreme Court has ruled otherwise, and that's something which everyone has to abide by. There's no two ways about that. So I really think that the whole thing of people going crazy about vaccine mandates, which I don't like, by the way, I'm not a fan of them. But people in the U.S., what it is that they never had as much liberty as they imagined that they did. And now they're finding out that they never had all this liberty, and they're sort of freaking out as a result. And I find that to be a very interesting phenomenon. Luke, anything to say about what Douglas Edward brought up?
Well, I remember how the alt right would mock the Constitution, and people who gave a damn about the Constitution from, I don't know, 2014 to 2017, and now some of those same people who were mocking the Constitution for years, now suddenly they are holding it up as this holy sacred object to which we must always bow. So all sorts of people on the dissident right, who I don't remember talking about the Constitution in praiseworthy terms for many, many years, they're suddenly all about the Constitution when it comes to government reactions to COVID. So from my perspective, no Constitution's a death warrant. So whether or not something's constitutional is an interesting legal question, and by all means fight it out in the courts. But to me, the main question should always be the survival and the flourishing of my people. And so people who don't think very deeply think that democracy and dictatorship are opposites. And in the United States, we're blessed to live in a flourishing democracy, and it's the furthest thing possible away from a dictatorship. Well, every functioning democracy contains considerable elements of dictatorship. You cannot have a functioning government that cannot become dictatorial at times. And so in reaction to perceived emergencies and real emergencies, all democratic governments start becoming dictatorial. So all those rights that you think are God-given, right? I don't believe in God-given rights. The only rights that we have are rights that our group manages to protect and extend to us in a certain circumstance. As soon as that circumstance changes, those rights are going to change. So people think they have God-given inalienable rights to, petition the government to gather together in a group and hold a rally, to worship as they see fit, and to do all these things that suddenly were taken away during COVID. And I think that was salutary in the extent that it makes people realize that should make a thinking person realize that all rights are contingent. They're contingent upon certain circumstances and certain situations. The situation changes, those rights are going away. And so this idea that democracy and dictatorship are opposites, it's just silly. When a policeman arrests you or pulls you over, he has almost dictatorial powers. The United States president has the same rights over American foreign policy as George III had over British foreign policy in the 18th century. Presidents could launch military excursions or even nuclear conflicts, or threaten nuclear conflicts, like John F. Kennedy with the Cuban Missile Crisis. A large part of John F. Kennedy's motivation for the Cuban Missile Crisis was to look strong for the midterm elections. And that's the way that the system is built. All rights can be taken away in the face of a real emergency, or even just what might be an emergency. And so there's nothing that's going to protect you but power, right? You really want your people to have power. You want people who think like you and identify like you to have power. You can't rely on the Constitution to protect your rights. People with power crush people who don't have power, because the way the world works is the strong take what they want and the weak endure what they must. I would much rather be strong. I don't yearn to lie, face forward on a bed and get raped. I mean, that's not what I want. Therefore, I want my people and my group to have power.
And if you have a reasonable, responsible question or comment for Luke or myself, please leave it via Streamlabs. Thank you very much in advance. Leave it as soon as you can. I just threw the link back into the live chat. Okay, I am refreshing the page. Hang on. It's coming along. Let's see. Hang on. The cartwheel is spinning. It's spinning. It's spinning. The page is taking a minute to load. I'm sorry. I wish I knew why, but what can I say? Here we are. Okay, now the page has loaded. There are a few things. From K-Max McDonald, the U.S. Census puts whites at 57.8% of the population, the lowest in its history, and declining. How do you both see this affecting the future of American democracy? I see all conservative ideals going down the toilet due to your views on this. There's no question that whites are the bulwark of American political conservatism. It's not even really so much as a coherent conservative movement today as it is opposition to whatever the left is up to. And nowadays it's the woke left. Clearly, the new census data indicates that the Republican Party is in an ever more precarious position when it comes to winning presidential races, but also for the upcoming redistricting. Although in Texas and Florida, where there would be the most intense redistricting when it comes to the gain or loss of seats for any given party, the Republicans will do well in both states because of who controls these states, which is the GOP. But all the same, from across the country, if you're looking at the situation nationally, not just in Florida or Texas, it's not good for the GOP. And I've been saying it for a while that the left is destined to take over America, and they are destined to rule it as a one-party state. I think the GOP could be relevant for a few decades more in Congress if it plays its cards right in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. But for presidential races, I don't see the GOP being a viable force beyond the early 2030s, and maybe it won't even be that late. So, yeah, the new census data certainly does show how the GOP is in an ever more weakening position, and I cannot see political conservatism, movement conservatism coming back at any point. So I think the future of American democracy is something more and more left leaning, to say the absolute least. Luke, anything to say about what K-Max brought up?
Right. So U.S. Census data is like CDC data. Some of it's more solid than other data. So how do they assemble U.S. Census? So if I'm 1/16th Chinese. So if I wrote down on the U.S. Census that I am Asian American and Caucasian American, how would the U.S. Census count that? They would count me as 100% Asian. So that's the way the U.S. Census operates. It is incentivized to make America look as least white as possible. Someone writes down that they're 1/8 black and 7/8 Caucasian. They go down in the U.S. Census as 100% black. So one of the things that made me lose respect for the dissident right was U.S. Census Bureau data was the foundation for much of dissident right anxiety and rhetoric and analysis for years and years and years, but they had no understanding of the data that they were referring to. They didn't bother to look into how is it compiled? How does U.S. Census Bureau data match with reality? It's just such shallow, shoddy scholarship because, yeah, there is some reality that European Americans, Caucasian Americans are a diminishing share of the total. But the way the U.S. Census Bureau conducts its work, it grossly exaggerates this decline because there is a greatly exaggerated and incentivized flight from white. So that the way that the Bureau conducts itself, if someone lists themselves as Latino and Caucasian, they go down as 100% non-white on the U.S. Census Bureau. So when you hear statistics from the CDC or from U.S. Census Bureau, I don't think one should react with either, oh, that's stupid because that comes from the government, can't possibly be right, and nor do I think, oh, I'm now going to dedicate my whole life to saving the white race because the U.S. Census Bureau says X, Y, Z. One should pause and do some research and how much do U.S. Census Bureau data match reality? It's not 100% match.
And from KMAX, once again, I think you will both agree on this. In 2024, the Democrats won't even need voter fraud to win elections anymore. By that election, they simply have the votes to win. Do you both agree on this? I certainly do. I've been saying this for quite a while, that especially in Georgia, I don't think that they will need any more votes. I think it's great to have those. I have also been saying these voter integrity laws on the books, which are coming up in certain GOP states, but they need to come up in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin as well, and Michigan too. So, I think that there's no question that the Democrats are getting such a groundswell of support as time goes by in certain key states. that they would not need fraud to win in 2024 at the rate things are going. But that being said, I think that if there are serious election integrity laws on the books, particularly in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, I think that would be very good for the Republican nominee. But it's very possible, by the way, that the Democrats could win the presidential election and still win those three states that I just mentioned, specifically if Texas flips, which is quite unlikely, I think, for 2024, but it is quite possible all the same. So, yeah, it's sort of a multifaceted situation, but I do think the Democrats won't need voter fraud by 2024. I've been saying that about Georgia specifically. And I think that even though the voter integrity bills would help the GOP in certain very important states, the Democrats might legitimately win the 2024 race all the same. Luke, anything to say about what K-Max brought up?
Yeah, I don't think the prospects for the Republican Party are nearly as dark as you think. I believe the Republicans have a 50% chance of winning the presidential election in 2024, 2028, 2032, because the Democratic coalition is inherently unstable. The only thing that unites the Democratic coalition is hatred of white people, in particular white Christian men. So Asians may start splitting away from the Democratic coalition when it's in their self-interest to do so. Latinos may increasingly start splitting away. Black men may start splitting away. So I don't think it's over by any means. So the Republican coalition, I think, would be best served by going in the Trumpian direction. So being the party of the working class, being a party that protects certain levels of entitlement, a populist party without being moronic, I think is a way forward. And I don't think we need to despair about Republican prospects. I think Republican prospects are pretty solid for both the midterms next year and going forward.
I think the GOP will do well in the midterms. From K-Max, once again, now that Luke and Cotto have debated each other on the kill stream, what would be an ideal next opponent and topic? I like Luke debating the Judaism issue and Cotto on economics with Pedro Gonzalez. Interesting. I don't know who Luke would debate the Judaism matter with, but it would be an interesting debate. There certainly is a lot of ignorance about Judaism out there, and he could shine some light on it. I would very much be glad to debate Pedro Gonzalez about economics, even though I'm not like some sort of Rothbardian libertarian, but still, I think Pedro's perspective is very, very, very short-sighted. Luke, anything to say about what K-Max brought up?
Yeah, blood sports are fun. I enjoy them. I like to argue over. David Cole Stein wrote an essay that got a lot of resonance in the distant right about 6 weeks ago, saying that the combination of Jews and blacks is going to destroy America. Well, the percentage of the American population that's Jewish and black was considerably larger in the past than it is now. The United States is still the strongest country in the world. I don't think there's anything inherent about an America that contains a few million Jews and 20 million blacks that's going to destroy America. So I think people like David Cole Stein, and there are a lot of people like him. I'm trying to think, who's the guy who sits in for Tucker Carlson and Rush Limbaugh? Mark Stein. So there are a lot of characters out there on the right who are tremendously entertaining, but usually the more entertaining the writer or the character, the less accurate they are. And so David Cole is a bomb thrower, and he's frequently hilarious, but he's out where the buses don't run no more. He's like way beyond the data. He has an entertainment value if you've got a certain mindset, but it's not exactly sober analysis. I don't think we should ever expect sober analysis from David Cole. If you simply read him or read a Richard Spencer or Mark Stein for entertainment value, it's not going to do you any harm, but I wouldn't read any of them for wisdom.
And from Life of Brian, there are times when you need a strong government response. For example, Australian, on the news of 9 whole COVID deaths, saved the human race by putting the whole population under house arrest and policing dissent because they are smart like Luke Ford. I think this is clearly satire, and I also think it's clearly intended for Luke. Luke, anything to say about what Brian brought up?
So, I mean, it's factually not accurate. The Australian population is not under house arrest. They've imposed some lockdowns. I don't have a strong position on. I don't think lockdowns are the horror show that critics say, and I don't think they're necessarily the salvific effect that its proponents say. So whether the government locks you down or whether people just lock themselves down, there doesn't seem to be that big of a difference. Now, it sounds much more dramatic when the government locks down, but in states, all right, you got states that are bordering each other. One state, the government has locked the state down. The next state, the government has not locked people down. Is there much difference in human activity? No, there's not much difference in human activity. Just that one state, we've got what we're told is a government lockdown, but there are just so many holes in it that people still essentially do what they want in most things. And then another state, there's no government lockdown, but people take understandable precautions. People stopped going to restaurants before the government closed restaurants. Right? People make decisions based on incentives. So I don't know whether Sydney, Australia right now is pursuing the best possible policy to mitigate COVID vaccine. I don't have any strong allegiance one way or another on some particular application of lockdown policies. But I will argue that most lockdown policies are overblown in importance, whether you're overblowing the importance on a critical side or in a adulatory side, because people essentially lock themselves down when the threat is severe enough, and people break government lockdowns when they don't see the threat as severe. So much of the lockdown is not the result of government policy. Economic losses are not primarily the result of government lockdown policies. Economic losses and people locking themselves down are primarily the result of individuals making decisions which they regard in their best interests. So I know most people want to think that there's some like bad people out there who are taking what should be a utopian life and making it a dystopia. But that's not how it is. People who run our governments are just as flawed as we are. They're scrambling, they're trying things. And I know it's very tempting to say, oh, all our problems are these government politicians, these bureaucrats are imposing lockdowns on us. But people lock down themselves when it's rational or they think it's in their interest to do so.
And if you have a reasonable and responsible question or comment for Luke or myself, please leave it via Streamlabs. Leave it as soon as you can because we will not be here forever. Thank you very much in advance. I'm going to refresh Streamlabs now and see if there's anything else here before we resume discussing COVID. Let's see, specifically the right's response to COVID. And the cartwheel is spinning. It's spinning. The page is taking a minute to load. Hang on. It's coming up. I think we're almost there. And we are. Or let me see. Let me make sure that I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing. I am, yes. From Row House, Biden said by 2030 he wants 40 to 50% of cars to be electric on the road. Is this goal possible, or does it put too much strain on the electrical grid? How do you guys view energy? It's a topic I don't see discussed much on our side. Very interesting question, Rowhouse. I think that it's a good idea to have electric cars on the road in as high a degree as possible, but it's very difficult to manage the rollout of these cars and also to have a system of adequate powering of these vehicles. I think it certainly would put a hell of a lot of strain on the electrical grid. I think Biden's goal is theoretically possible, but as with other such theoreticals, the practicality is likely to be something altogether different. I think energy is a tremendously important matter in too many ways to get into here, and I think it deserves utmost attention, and not just that, but respect. And it is not discussed much on the right for whatever reason, but it should be. And I think that electrical cars are good. I think, like I said, increased emphasis on the study of energy is good. But at the same time, I think that Biden's goal is very ambitious. And I think that it would put a lot of strain on the electrical grid. Luke, anything to say about what Row House brought up?
No, I don't. But I would have to think about, research the issue a lot more. But I just had a related thought on the right and COVID. And we talked before the show that we'd also talk about how the right has responded to COVID around the world. And
Certainly.
it seems to me the populists in power around the world have been similarly incompetent with regard to COVID. So Bolsonaro in Brazil, AMLO in Mexico, Putin, Erdogan, Modi in India, that like these two major countries like Brazil and India run by, I understand it as right-wing populists, that they haven't done too well with COVID. So I think certainly there are tighter societies that are going to deal better with situations like COVID. So what they sacrifice in creativity, they benefit from having a tight, constrained, conformist society like Northeast Asia. So those type of societies are always going to do much better in a pandemic that requires a overall social discipline than an individualist society like the United States of America. And I think that's another aspect of the right-wing response to COVID, is that many people on the right are strongly individualist. And these are particularly the libertarian-leaning members of the right. And so they are going to react badly to government mandates. So I think the United States is about the most individualist country in the world, of which I'm aware. And so a country that's as individualist as the United States is always going to have a much tougher time dealing with a pandemic. And so often situations determine politics. So if immigration, welfare fraud, rising crime rates is the number one issue that concerns people, then the right wing, particularly right wing populists, should do fairly well. But if the number one issue that is confronting people is healthcare and COVID or fairness, then parties of the left are going to do well. So generally speaking, I think right-wing populist and nationalist governments have not fared well politically during COVID, but I do expect that the world is going to become much more nationalist after COVID, that nations are going to become more self-sufficient, and there may be some areas where nations have increased cooperation to deal with threats like COVID, but I think the overall response will be, the world post-COVID will be more nationalistic than it was pre-COVID.
And is there any country that you could think of which has a government of the right that has managed COVID well?
I would assume the Japanese government, it's made some mistakes with regard to vaccine, but aside from that, I think the Japanese government, it's a party of the right, and they've done a good job with COVID. I don't know if the Taiwanese government is right wing, but they certainly did a very good job with COVID. I don't know if the South Korean government is right wing, but they certainly seem to do a good job with COVID. But these governments are really reflections of a conformist society, which is going to be much more well suited for dealing with COVID. And the United States did really well in that almost all medical innovation comes from the United States. So the United States has led the way in getting vaccines. England has also done very well in developing vaccines. So there is a tremendous creativity and a yearning for invention in people in the United States and in England and in Anglo societies. So that's been demonstrated. I think the United States is going to come roaring out of the COVID pandemic. The workers have become so much more efficient. Like fewer workers are getting more done. People are increasingly working from home, so they're saving an hour or two on commute. But all sorts of technological changes that people were lagging on, they've now implemented thanks to COVID. So now instead of going to school for parent-teacher night, people will Zoom with their kids' teachers. Yeshivas, instead of holding meetings for parents at night, will just do it over Zoom. So I think there are so many innovations and advancements that are going to have a very positive effect on particularly the United States, but other first world industrialized nations, and the gap between the industrialized nations and the rich and the poor will probably widen as a result of the pandemic.
It's interesting to see, I suppose, what would become of that, because the gap has been widening for some time as it is, and if it grew wider, I think the amount of socio-political strife which could result that could hardly be placed into words.
Yeah. And so, like, it's like, I remember 10 years ago, I needed to move, and it was a major trauma for me. Like, why was it a trauma for me? Because my economic situation was so dire. So change and challenge becomes, dire for people who are poor. And so the COVID pandemic was such a massive change and challenge that it's always going to be more dire for the poor. People who earn $60 an hour or more did not lose income during the COVID pandemic in the United States because these people, by and large, can work from home. Most people who I know well were able to work from home. And so most people I know well, the pandemic was not something that was particularly onerous for them. But people who are earning less than $20 an hour, they got slaughtered by the pandemic because most of their jobs either shut down or they were forced to perform jobs that were incredibly risky. Now, people who didn't study in school, who didn't develop the discipline to have job skills that would enable a prosperous life, they're going to be much more disadvantaged by any kind of crisis than people with assets. And the most important asset that any one of us can have is friends, family, and community. Like that's more important than money in the bank. The number one thing you can do to survive an earthquake is to know your neighbors and to know people around you who you can make common cause with to survive a crisis. So people who are isolated, people who lacked vital connections, people who are on the brink in their mental health or their financial health, they were much more likely to be devastated by the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting points, and obviously very depressing is not the word, but very serious. And this is stuff that I think people often take for granted. But you're absolutely correct in what you're saying, and people really should consider that, especially if they consider themselves to be preppers or survivalists or this or that or the other thing. It really is interesting how really there is a lack of social networking in the U.S. today, as well as the developed world. Moreover, even though social media has created too many new social networks to even discuss. Of course, when I say when I talk about the social network deficit, I'm referring to in real life social networks, not someone online who lives across the world and you've never met. So it's interesting to see how what this means, I suppose, for society in the long run. And one interesting thing that I've seen today, this is getting a bit off of COVID, but I think Luke would probably find it interesting all the same, is that for those who are under 40, there's a real lack of a personal or group identity of any fixed kind. And these are people who have been raised disproportionately in single households, or even if the household is intact, perhaps your mother and father moved around a lot when you were young, and maybe you grew up in a broken home where there was a lot of moving around. And people don't really know much about their nation's history. They don't know much about their region's history. They don't know much about their own family history or the history of their heritage. And that really creates a unique state of affairs where you have these people who sort of drift from identity to identity. This is acted out principally online. It's called LARPing, which is called live action role playing. I'm sure Luke knows exactly what I'm talking about. And you see a lot of this among younger people today. As a matter of fact, there is one person that I chat with on Twitter. And this person appeared to be a moderate Republican with very interesting takes. But then now this person is like within the span of a summer, not a long time at all. Now this person is like a groiper who makes anti-Semitic remarks and this and that and the other thing. And it's quite weird, but it's someone who's in the 20s. So I think this fits in well to the sort of pattern I'm referring to here. People with a lack of a fixed identity, and they're just sort of like a candle in the wind blowing here or there and casting their flame in different directions without much rationality behind it. It's really interesting. I don't know how a country can function once it hits a critical mass of people such as this and its populace. Luke, anything to say about what I just brought up? I know it was a little long-winded, but I hope I communicated my point clearly all the same.
Yeah, I liked it. I mean, a lot of people are into prepping, but the number one thing you could do to prep is to have friends and family, to have people who care about you and people that you care about. and people with whom you have a history of cooperation, or at least hanging out and enjoying time together, and that you have some sort of community, religious, social, around a hobby, around a profession, around education. That's the number one thing that you can do to prep, is to have a social network, to have people to whom you contribute to their life, so that they are then incentivized to want to look out for you. I live in Southern California. At any moment now, we will have a major earthquake that will render life for most people in Southern California impossible to carry on in Southern California. We'll have to get up and leave because water, sewage, power will be down, not just for days, not necessarily for weeks, but very possibly for months. So where would you move to? Like if you lost your house, where would you live? Like who would take you in? So I noticed with people in dissident spheres, as well as people with addictions, perhaps, and people in the porn industry, perhaps the number one trait about their social lives is that they are alienated from other people, that they have fallen out with their families, they've fallen out with their communities, and this puts you in a precarious position. So many people on the distant right think that America is coming to an end. Well, if American civilization is coming to an end, you better have a really good social support system. I mean, you better have options, and you're going to have options through knowing people. And so the way that most people get jobs is because you know people. If you need a good doctor, it's because you know someone. The difference between a great doctor and a good doctor may indeed be your life. I was bedridden for 6 years in my 20s, and I saw 50 different doctors. Then I saw one great doctor who gave me a medication and returned my life to me. I mean, I spent 6 years bedridden, met one great doctor. He gave me my life. There are people out there who can give you life. And if you're not connected to such people, or connected to people who know people who can give you life, you're in a very precarious situation.
Indeed, you are. And it's interesting how a lot of folks don't recognize the reality of what it is that you're communicating. Before we go on, any thoughts on, I suppose, younger generations having these identities that they adopt and discard, apparently found a yearning for consistency, but at the same time, obviously, these people are searching for some sort of personal or group identity.
Yeah, I mean, people need to belong. Like, we live in a classically liberal society where people think that people are primarily individuals who are born with certain inalienable rights. And I don't think that's a useful way of looking at the world. I think a much more useful way of looking at the world is that we're all born into a tribe. Now, your tribe may be Seventh-day Adventists, it may be Orthodox Jews, it may be Korean Americans, but we're all born into a tribe. And that's the matrix in which we're going to live. Like, try to go through life as an individual. I know so many people who I encountered through these live streams who tell me, oh, I don't like living in community. Like, I find community stifling. And community does make demands on you. When I speak to you right now, I think about the implications primarily for me within my Orthodox Jewish community. I speak on live streams as though every member of my Orthodox Jewish community is watching. But I also take in mind what would be the consequences when I walk down the street, if I was to ride the subway, if I was to be at Dodger Stadium. And so living in a community makes considerable demands on you. You have to thread the needle. I can't just blurt out everything that I want to say. I have in my mind things I want to say, and then I have to calibrate them to, okay, how would different communities that I participate in, how would they react to what I'm about to say? And then what could be the long-term complications or issues going down weeks or months or years from now. So that requires some thinking. It requires a lot more effort than if I just stand here and blurt things out. So there does, by various statistical measurements, seem to be a loneliness epidemic in the United States, and that's disturbing. I think partly it could relate to the breakdown of organized religion, the breakdown of the family. And I think for many people who are kind of on the edge, then they can get so entranced by video games and technology that these technological fixes can temporarily mitigate the pain, but the more they take the technological fix, then the less adept they become with their social skills at being with other people. So a lot of people who are kind of on the border of being socially functional or dysfunctional perhaps tip more into the dysfunctional because they have found something that stops the pain and confusion and annoyance and boredom inside of them, and so they become so engrossed by video games or opportunities with regard to technology that they lose valuable social skills. Also, as we become a more diverse society, it's much harder to form connections. Like, we are built to connect with people with whom we're very similar. I remember I was going to Temple one Friday night, and the mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, spoke, and he encouraged us all to go out and speak to someone who doesn't speak our language. How can you speak to someone when you don't share a common language? You can't. I mean, I did that with one relationship. I had one relationship where the girl didn't speak English, but we had a bond in a certain kind of activity that we really enjoyed, and so words were not so necessario. But generally speaking, to form bonds, you need the more you have in common. Like, Joseph, the more things you don't have in common with your friends or community, the more pressure that puts on a relationship. If you simply disagree about your favorite sports team or your favorite politicians or your favorite music, like, every disagreement that you have with your friends puts a strain on the relationship. Now, most relationships can handle it, but the primary point remains: the more you have in common with the friend, the more likely that friendship is to survive. And we tend to go through our social network by about 50% about every 7 years. And so a lot of people have fallen out over allegations of voter fraud. A lot of people have fallen out over COVID. People fall out over disagreements about, who should start a quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. So it's if people want to research this, just look up balance theory. Essentially, the more you have in common with people, the more solid your relationship.
Very true. It's interesting because nowadays everything has become so politicized. So even things that people would typically not regard as being partisan or having anything to do with the political process, they become points of political contention. And since political disputes have become so vitriolic in this day and age, it does absolutely result in more destroyed relationships. And the question is, does this actually destroy the relationship, or is the relationship so weak to begin with that it could not withstand this change in what's considered to be politically acceptable, at least in terms of political discussions?
Yeah. I mean, that's why religion is one of the greatest ways to form connections around, because you have some allegiance to something transcendent. Or even communism. Like, if you're commies together, you have something that transcends ordinary life. I assume Antifa have a lot of fulfilling relationships, or it wouldn't be so strong. I assume that Black Lives Matter people have a lot of fulfilling relationships. You don't build movements of this size just by money. I think people get into them and find friends and find people that they have sex with, and they bond.
Certainly. It's interesting because I think that wokeness is not just a political phenomenon, it's a religion. It's a post Christian religion. You see people engaging in ritualized activities. They have what you would call spiritual experiences with their activism, and they form a group that polices morality in the same way, publicly polices morality, of course, in the same way that organized supernatural religions tended to do for any given society. So I think that really it's interesting because people would say that as society becomes more secular, people leave superstitions and the desire for some sort of organized religious presence behind. But as we see with the ascendancy of wokeness, that has not been the case.
Yeah, I mean, people need to belong to an in-group, and with wokeness, there's a special vocabulary. There's a special way of talking about life and approaching life that separates you from everybody else, and that should provide you with bonds, and it should provide you with energy. I remember the one thing that turned around my financial life is that I joined a group of people who were struggling with their financial life, and because we had daily meetings, I got a tremendous surge of energy because we were all united around this common problem, and we were all talking about things we were doing to transcend our problem, and so we inspired each other. If you can just join with a group of people around a common purpose and get into sync with that group, whether you're praying, whether you're running, whether you're performing Shakespeare, or you're woke, or you're Black Lives Matter, or you're Antifa, you will get a surge of power and energy that you will not experience on your own. You will become a different person. You will become a stronger, more confident, more secure person than if you're just going through life alone. So I think that a lot of individuals who shun community, they have no idea of the strength and the power and the enthusiasm and the energy that comes from joining with other people, not to mention all the benefits you get. Like, people give you insights. Hey, I can get you a job here. You should date my friend here. We're all going to dinner there. We've all got a great deal on an Airbnb here. There's just no comparison between life with community and life without community.
Obviously so, and there are less and less real world communities as time goes on, not just in the US, but the developed world moreover. Very interesting to see how people become more atomized. And I'm a big fan of individualism, but as there's no question that a society becomes more atomized and produces certain problems which were not had beforehand. And it's hard to describe, but it's something of a balancing act, if you will. This is not the last call, but it is the call before the last call. If you have a reasonable and responsible question or comment for Luke or myself, please do leave it via Streamlabs, and leave it as soon as you can, because we will be going pretty soon. This is not the last call, but it is once again the call before the last call. So Luke, getting back to the right and COVID, do you suppose that, and I think you mentioned this at the onset of the discussion, it really is something of a communal identity thing now, downplaying COVID, eschewing the vaccine, and people could just be doing this not necessarily because they even have any sort of serious belief in the accuracy of their claims, but just because it's like a tribal identifier. Do you think that did I generally get your perspective correct?
Yes.
Am I correct in what I'm saying? Well, what's your take on it?
Yes, and to have a tribal identifier, it doesn't need to be ontologically correct. It doesn't need to be true. The Democrats were very effective at limiting the effectiveness of the Trump administration by blowing up bogus charges about how Russia rigged the 2016 elections. So this COVID skepticism, this vaccine skepticism, it may not be factually accurate, it may not even be pro-social, but it may be an effective glue that unites people and bonds people. Just like I don't believe that the 2020 elections, no, I haven't seen evidence yet, to my mind, that the 2020 elections were stolen, but belief that the 2020 elections were stolen could be a powerful energizing force for Republicans. It could unite people, it could bond people, it could enable all sorts of people to achieve things that they could not otherwise achieve without that belief. I think there are probably thousands of people who've gone off crack through their relationship with Jesus Christ. And the ontological truth about Jesus Christ is not necessary for people to go off crack through believing in Jesus Christ. So whether or not a belief is true or false says nothing about whether it's effective at getting things done, at moving society in a certain direction, or even in forming bonds or developing a more exciting or meaningful or passionate life.
And when it comes to the COVID skepticism and the anti-vaccine sentiment, what about these things for the right, specifically in the United States? What do you think is so effective that it could cause a sort of bonding that could be politically beneficial for the GOP? There has to be something unique to this COVID and this vaccine situation that gives it such juice, so to speak.
Well, yeah, different societies resonate to different values, and America puts more of a premium on freedom than any other society of which I'm aware. So when you are pushing a theme, which is probably the number one value in your society, you're on a winning wicket. I mean, that's a really good thing. To be an American social, cultural, and political movement that makes freedom your number one value, you are in consonance with the history of this country. Also, the suspicion of elites, and also just the realization of naked government power and how so many things that used to be done behind closed doors and then be delivered de facto to us so that we didn't even question them. Like, there are all sorts of decisions by governments and bureaucrats and public health authorities that we've never even thought about to question. Almost everything we know, we know because we believe, because an authority said it to us, all right? We almost know nothing based on our own verification. We know virtually everything because we get it from an authority. Now, COVID comes along and we realize so many of the authorities are naked and flawed and conflicted. And so it will probably incentivize people to question all sorts of conventional wisdoms and conventional truths and science says. Like when governors and particularly Democratic politicians were talking about they were going to respond to COVID on the directions of science. Well, science did not say how to respond to COVID. So politicians saying we're going to operate according to science. Science doesn't say anything. Like COVID is in part a medical condition, but responses to COVID, social, societal responses to COVID are largely a political decision. And it's a political decision with inadequate information. So I think this skepticism with regard to COVID and skepticism with regard to the conventional wisdom, that there is a lot of utility for it because often it is warranted. And all sorts of government pronouncements and public health pronouncements and expertise pronouncements that people prior to COVID just accepted, didn't even think to question them. People will now start questioning them, and I think there will be a lot of positive returns to that, as well as possibly negative ones.
It'll be interesting to see what happens, to say the absolute least. Do you suppose that perhaps as the virus goes on, people on the right might become more receptive toward taking the pandemic seriously as well as getting the vaccine? I bring this up because there was this one right-wing talk show host in Florida, and he actually was a fill-in host on Newsmax, and he was very anti-vaccine, very minimalistic about COVID. But then he got the virus, and he died of it a few days ago. And when he was on his deathbed, he was encouraging then people to get the vaccine and to take the pandemic seriously. Do you think more stories such as this might change the view of the American right on the pandemic and the vaccines?
Yes. So it will definitely make some impact. I mean, when you go against reality, in the long run, reality wins. Like in the end, most people have to accommodate themselves to reality. Now, some people can function denying reality for their entire lives, but most people get tired of denying reality. So I would think most QAnon supporters, previous QAnon supporters, are now embarrassed. And so I think a substantial number of COVID vaccine skeptics are similarly embarrassed.
I think it will be something just to see, look at the social psychology of it, how the right-wing skepticism of COVID and the vaccines in the U.S. plays out during the year and the years to come. I think there'll be many interesting lessons to be learned from this phenomenon. And I really do think that, a lot of people who are anti-vaccine now probably were anti-vaccine even when Trump was in office. And they have many different reasons for it. I don't want to generalize, but I think perhaps on the right, they're in America, any kind of vaccine is seen as something foreign, injurious, and how do I put this? Eroding of personal liberties somehow. That's not to say that everyone on the right is a vaccine skeptic on the whole. That's definitely not true. But certainly there is some sort of skepticism of vaccines. And you've even seen it on the left as well. It actually came out of the left on the sort of hippie left, and then in the downscale urban communities in various cities. So it's a very, very interesting, multifaceted matter that's hard to put into words, but it's certainly of relevance to what's going on today.
And I saw a lot of people on the dissident sphere discussing a study that came out today that shows 23% of PhDs are COVID vaccine skeptical, while people with master's degrees are the least COVID skeptical. And I see all this, triumphalism about this, and no skepticism that maybe this survey or poll is not accurate. People get information that if it fits with the way they see the world, then they embrace it. And there's not much, and I'm going to use a word that academics love to use, there's not much interrogation of the data. So I'm highly skeptical that while people with master's degrees are the least skeptical with regard to COVID vaccines, that people with PhDs are the most skeptical. So I'm skeptical of that report today.
Yeah, it really is. It really is something. These studies, these reports. There was one that showed, or it might have been two. I forgot. There have been so many of these. They all just sort of run together after a while. but there were reports about Johnson and Johnson's vaccine not being effective against the Delta variant. And then a lot of people were saying, well, this J&J vaccine not only kills you with blood clots, but it doesn't protect you from the Delta variant. What a piece of garbage. And then a news study came out from South Africa with about 30,000 people showing that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was remarkably effective against the Delta variant. And so you have these studies that say different things, but the initial studies had a very small sample group. And so obviously that threw them off a bit. But these studies are done very often by people who, as I said before, we live in a very politicized age. They're done by academics who are very politicized. And they various studies, as Luke mentioned, are funded to reach a certain outcome by the people who are paying for them. So, a study that says this or that or the other thing, you do have to really you have to take the study for what it's worth. You have to look at the internals of it, so to speak, try to find out who funded it. But at the same time, it's not a good idea just to dismiss anything because it came out of academia or big pharma or from the government. Everything has to be done on a case by case basis, as Luke was mentioning before.
Yes, so I think the right is going to survive their stupidity with regard to COVID, and I don't think anything is written in stone for the future. So I think that the right's got some good chances in the 2022 midterms. Going forward, it will depend what's issue number one for Americans. If issue is illegal immigration, then the populist right will be in very good position. But if healthcare is the number one issue, then I would expect Democrats would do better.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I don't know what will be. I know that there was some internal polling that I was made privy to from a very good pollster, and there are very few good pollsters out there, obviously. And it shows that the Democrats are not doing well as of this summer, insofar as next year's midterms go. But obviously, there's a lot of time between now and the midterms, so folks should not take that as being any sort of guarantee of success. Anyway, this is the last call. If you have a reasonable and responsible question or comment for Luke or myself, please leave it via Streamlabs, but leave it as soon as you can because this is the last call. I've just thrown the link into the live chat. So, Luke, as we do finally wind things down here, I really do think that a lot of people on the American right, we've talked about the global right, but the American right, when they see information that conflicts with their take on COVID, they dismiss it. They say it's false, it's this or that, even if it's firsthand accounts of young people getting sick with COVID and then dying of it in a hospital. And there is this point of view that the virus is not all that bad. That we talked a lot about the vaccine, but there's this point of view on the right that the virus is just like the seasonal flu, and it's not really a matter of any great significance. What is your take on that perspective?
Yeah, so according to the statistics, I quote the study on my blog in the coronavirus section that COVID is about 40 times more deadly than the 2019-2020 flu. So COVID, which was fairly average. So in general, I think it's fair to say that COVID's about 40 times more deadly than an average seasonal flu. And then talking about polling, that's another important issue. There are widespread people on the distant spheres who want to just dismiss polling. And pollsters have been about 90% accurate with regard to who's going to win presidential elections over the past 70 years. So pollsters are not perfectly accurate, but that doesn't mean you dismiss the whole profession. If you want to interrogate a certain poll, you look at how it was conducted and with whom was it conducted. Pollsters provide some valuable insights, just like weather forecasting. Weather forecasting today is much better than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And our weather forecasts, they overwhelmingly depend upon government-operated satellites. All right, so AccuWeather takes government data and tries to monetize it, but they're getting their data from the government. So not everything the government does is stupid and pointless and inefficient. The government does some good work along with some shoddy work, just like I do some good work along with some shoddy work, and Joseph does some good work, and even Joseph has some shoddy work as well. So I don't like this idea that the government's the problem. Sometimes the government's the problem. Sometimes government's the solution. Sometimes government's a mixture of both.
Not to speak of the government, but polling has become less accurate election by election cycle in recent years because less people use landlines. Number one, that's the way polls used to contact everyone. That was a very accurate way of doing so because that's the only way people would communicate by voice with each other if they weren't face to face. Now, with cell phones and also with people doing a lot more, text messaging, email, that kind of thing, it's become very difficult to get an accurate poll. And as a result, the results the results which even traditionally reliable pollsters get are being thrown off more and more. Gallup famously stopped doing presidential polling after the 2012 race because it basically came to the conclusion that its presidential polling was no longer worth doing because it was just too difficult to get an accurate sample. And I've been talking to a lot of pollsters over the years, and they tell me that it's just increasingly difficult to get an accurate sample of the population, especially when it comes to a presidential race, but also state level races too. But here it depends on the state. A place like Vermont is much easier to do an accurate poll in than a place like Florida. So polls are very much hit and miss, but they are getting harder and harder to do because people communicate with each other in increasingly diverse ways, and also people just don't like answering phones anymore when they get a call from someone who they don't know. So, and then people are on the right are often scared to talk to pollsters. I actually did a survey about this, an anonymous one from last year, and it was found that people who talk to pollsters, I found that people who are on the right generally don't want to talk to pollsters. They don't trust pollsters. Some of them even give false information to pollsters. So it's really something else with these public polls. And even, the private polls are more accurate. They cost a lot more money, but even they can be thrown off too.
Yeah, so it's amazing what you can do when you combine money with expertise. So not everything that's a poll is equally valuable. So not every piece of government data is equally valuable. Not everything the CDC says is equally valuable. Like Anthony Fauci may say something that's correct one day and something that's wrong the next day. I may say something that's smart one minute and say something really stupid the next minute. People and situations are complicated.
That they are, and certainly people like things to be more simple than these things truly are by their very nature. And this desire for simplification, for oversimplification, creates a lot of needless problems, to say the absolute least.
Yes.
And I'm just checking now to see if there's anything else here on Streamlabs. I don't want to leave anyone out or miss anyone's stuff. I don't think that's what I'm doing. I think that everything is okay, but I just have to double check. I will say, Luke, this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for coming on the show tonight.
Yeah, thank you. And I just thought of one more point. One of the
Sure.
sillier right-wing talking points about COVID
Mhm.
was that the left was using it for the Great Reset. Well, everybody uses everything they can, including crises, to try to bring about the ends that they desire. So resetting during a crisis is not just something that's uniquely on the left. Immigration restrictionists on the right were thrilled to use COVID to reset immigration policies and to restrict immigration. So there's this widespread silly talking point I find on the right about sinister new world order instituting a great reset, just taking COVID as an excuse. Everybody uses everything they can to get what they want. It's not something that's unique to the left.
Yeah, obviously people do. I think that whenever something happens, like a crisis that one side takes advantage of, the other side naturally gets very reflexively gets defensive about it and fearful. And it's totally understandable why. So on the left, you see a lot of people saying that the right is scapegoating immigrants, and on the right, you see a lot of people talking about the Great Reset. I think it's all rather predictable.
Yeah, I mean, we all do what we can. Like if I'm interested in a girl and she likes to talk about astrology, I'll talk about astrology. If she wants to talk about quantum mechanics, I'll talk about quantum mechanics. I'm a flexible guy.
All righty then. And on that note, since we talked for a few more minutes, I will do another refresh of Streamlabs to make sure absolutely nothing is here that we were supposed to get to. I doubt that it is, but you have to be sure. You don't want to leave anyone high and dry. That's not a nice thing to do at all. But but I don't think that's been the case. But the page is refreshing. And no, I think that was it. The last one was from Rowhouse. Well, Luke, once again, thank you very much for coming on the show tonight. It's been a great discussion. I've enjoyed it a great deal.
Thank you, Joseph Sovai, as always.
Excellent. Great. And I look forward to our next chat. Hopefully, my co host will be better by then and he'll be able to join us.
Absolutely.
Great. And thank you for tuning in, everyone. See you next time. Before we go, though, if you like this episode and want to support the show, please consider donating to it by clicking on the PayPal link in the description below. Paul and I appreciate your generosity very much. Also, consider checking out my new book, Runaway Masters, at Amazon. It's a nonfiction book, but I wrote it to read like an epic novel, and I hope that it does. So please do check it out. That really is all. Take it easy, everyone. Thanks for watching, and cheers.